Yeah, thank you. That is really helpful when you put your school in there. If you're a volunteer, please put CACE or that you're a volunteer. So it also helps me keep track of all of you. Um, and yeah, okay. Well, welcome. We're gonna keep letting people in, but we'll go ahead and get started in the interest of time. But welcome everyone to CASE's summer session 2. We are really excited to have you here with us again as we talk more about the We the People program and what this school year is going to look like and how we can help. We've got some exciting guests joining us here today, and we're really happy to have you all. So we're going to go around and just do a quick round of CASE volunteer introductions so everyone knows who people are. You'll see a lot of us this year, so it's helpful to know who the different volunteers are. I'll just kick things off and then we'll popcorn around and make sure we cover everyone. But hi, my name is Katie Keeshan. I am on the CASE board and have been a volunteer with this program for a while. I'm an alum of the program and I currently work as a park ranger with the National Park Service. And I'm going to popcorn over to Zoe.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe. I am an alum of the program. I graduated from Amador in 2019. I was Unit 1, and I'm still around. So, Comp Civics, We the People has meant a lot to me the past few years. I'm also on the CASE board. I just graduated from Cornell this past spring with a bachelor's in government and history, and I'm going to NYU Law this fall, which I'm super stoked about. And on top of that, CASE has been really helpful in that journey. Specifically, Clint and Sabrina have been huge helps for that. So I'm going to popcorn that over to Clint.
Don't tell them that I've been a help because that means everybody's going to ask. Hi, my name is Clint. I am the former president of CASE. I am also an alum of the program from 1995, back a long time ago, and I am a Deputy Attorney General for the state of California in the government law section. So my job is basically constitutional law on behalf of the state of California. It's pretty good. It's pretty fun. Yeah, so I will send it over to Rashad, who I haven't seen in a while. Hi, Rashad.
Hi, Clint. I'm Rashad. Nice to meet all of you. I am an alumni of Comp Civics. I was in Amador's Unit 4 in 2020, and I'm now just a rising senior at UC San Diego studying political science and philosophy. And then it'll probably be law school after that, but I gotta go through the whole application process, which will be fun. I'll pass it over to Jayani now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jayani Chidipodu. I am an alum of the program from 2022. I was on Unit 3. I'm really excited to be a part of CASE this year. I'll pass it off to Tom.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tom. I am an alum of the program as well. Graduated in 2022, so 2 years ago, and I was on Unit 2. I am currently a rising sophomore at Brown, studying political science and business economics. Yeah, this is my second year volunteering with CASE. Super excited to be back and to help you all through this process. I think I will go ahead and hand it over to Sean.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Sean Gentry. I'm an alum of the program from 2002, former Unit 1. These days, I'm an attorney. I practice employment law, mostly litigation, in San Francisco. I'm a partner of a small firm called Ad Astra Law Group. And I always love doing case work and working with the We the People students throughout the year. And I wish you all the best of luck this year. I'll throw it over. Has Caden gone yet? Caden.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Caden. I'm an alum from the program last year. I was in Unit 4. I'm now a rising freshman at George Mason, where I'm studying political science and kind of going further into that civic field. And with that, I'll popcorn over to Gordon.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Gordon, a alum from last year as well, Unit 2 from Foothill. And I'm currently I'm currently about to enter UC Davis for history and international relations, which is just very Unit 2. So love this program and everything. Oh, and I'll popcorn it over to Nicolette.
Hi, my name is Nicolette. I was also part of last year's team of Foothill. Unit 1, and I'm a rising freshman at UC Berkeley, and I'm planning to do philosophy, so that kind of matched. I'll pass it over to, let's see, who hasn't gone yet?
I think all of our volunteers have gone. I could be wrong about that. But we do actually now have a special guest that I would like to pass it over to. So we're going to pass it over to Emily Voss.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for your willingness to do this on a Saturday morning, whether you're a volunteer or a participant. Yeah, my name's Emily Voss, and I am here from the Center for Civic Education. And we are the producers of the We the People materials. So I guess you can think of us as kind of big We the People. My role there is the manager of national programs. And within that, I am one of the directors of the We the People national competition. So I just wanted to give you kind of a sense of like CCE's role in the sort of space of the school year and what you can expect and when from Center for Civic Ed. So just real briefly, our mission as an organization is to provide high quality civic and constitutional education for everyone as a means for a responsible and sustainable society. So We the People is one of our 2 flagship programs. The other one is Project Citizen. So some of you may have done Project Citizen in your classes as well. But for We the People, if you can kind of picture like a pyramid, Center for Civic Ed runs the national level competition, but we partner with 50 different state partners who will run the state level competitions. So our partners will be the ones who organize regionals, and I know there's regionals in California, and then state competitions to get you all launched and ready to go to the nationals. We produce the questions. So the state level questions will come out at the end of August. We are aiming for the week of the 28th, if not a little bit sooner, to have the state questions out. The national questions then tend to come out around late October. And so those will be posted on our website, and we'll share them with the state coordinators, and the state coordinators pass it on to all of your teachers. So the state level competitions, the earliest ones happen pretty much right after Thanksgiving, and then they happen through the end of January. So you all are kind of in the middle of the general spectrum of the state level competitions. And then our national competition this year is likely to be the weekend of April 11th. We're still finalizing the dates on that, but that's where we're aiming right now. And so that will be, of course, in Washington, D.C. So for all the volunteers who did this last year, you all know this, but we have the ability to have 48 teams go to the national finals. And if you are a state winner, then that's kind of an automatic invitation to come to the nationals. But we often have an opportunity to have wildcard teams as well. And wildcard opportunities go to the second place team from any particular state. Because we have a limited number of wildcards, we have kind of a rotation system where some states will get a wildcard invitation if they did not get one last year. And then some states choose not to accept wildcard invitations. So we just kind of move on down the list until we have all the wildcard spots filled. So there are some states that will often get them just because other states will have an invitation and will choose not to take them. Last year, we had 12 wildcard teams out of our total of 48. So we had quite a lot. I'm not sure how that will work out this year. We might have more state winners that decide to come this year that did not choose to come last year. But just to say, we're always going to have a really good opportunity for a lot of those second place teams to attend. And a lot of wildcard teams have historically done really well at the national finals. There's often wildcard teams, including California, who have often made the top 10. So that's kind of our role in the planning process. And, you know, I suppose I have a few extra minutes. If you have questions for me about the national structure or anything else to do with the national competition, please feel free to use the chat and let me know. We're obviously very excited about this year and looking forward to a great year's worth of competitions in all of our different states. And for those of you who are volunteers, if you have questions for me too, please feel free to ask.
I actually have a question. Oh,
First, Caden.
I'm going to be in DC for like most of my college years. Is there anything I can do to volunteer at the nationals competition?
Absolutely, you can. Okay, so I'm going to put my email in the chat. So I will say for the way that we choose our volunteers, judges have to have judged at a state competition before they can judge at a national competition.
Okay.
I am also in Virginia. I can hook you in with the Virginia group. So if you are able, you can volunteer in Virginia. But then for nationals, even if you're not eligible to be a judge, we always need help. People who are facilitators, who will be the timekeepers, and then folks who are wayfinders, because all of you who have competed at the National Conference Center know that it's a total maze in that building. So we always have volunteers to help wayfinding. We would be delighted to see you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
I had a quick question. Sorry, Sean. I'm always curious to see who the students can be expected to be judged by. Because in the past, I remember I was judged by like a constitutional law professor at Columbia, or like high school teachers. So it's always a really interesting group.
Yeah, so when we recruit our volunteers, as I said, they have to have judged at least at the state level before we invite them to judge at the nationals. But we do look for a really good mix. We look for historians. We look for people whose specialty is more in the philosophy range, people who are constitutional scholars, people who are lawyers. So we try to get a good mix of an academic perspective as well as practitioners, because everybody has a different perspective on the different issues at play in the questions. And I mean, hopefully you've experienced this as sitting on the student side of the table, but they always come up with really interesting questions based on their perspective. So that's who we look for. And a lot of the times the teachers that you see are kind of our secondary invites, because they know the material really, really well. So we can easily place them in pretty much any role we need them to fill. So that's kind of our strategy. And I'll say as well that we invite the state coordinators to select one or two people from their state, and we help bring them to Washington, D.C. so that there's also a geographic diversity that you're going to see as well. So that's something else we try to do.
So I hope this isn't putting you on the spot, but we've heard a rumor that there may be some changes coming to the score sheets for the first time in as long as I can possibly remember. Yes. And maybe that's still a secret a bit, but because we are using these sessions to teach the students for the coming year about the score sheet, we were wondering if you might have any tips you can share with us about those changes.
Sure. Yes. So we are in the middle of rewriting the scoring rubric, and at the moment it's out for comments from experienced judges. So the main thing I can tell you, unless something massively changes based on their comments, there's still going to be, the recognizable categories that y'all are used to in terms of evidence, analysis, that it's just going to be a little bit more specific for the judges to give them an example of what they are looking for, because y'all have seen the score sheets on You're going to do a deep dive. That's a really vague score sheet. So we've tried to clarify some of those different sections. So for example, what makes analysis different from application? we've tried to kind of spell that out a little bit more clearly. And then we have also tried to more broadly allow for what has been the participation category will transition to something that takes into account the broader depth of discussion. So from a judge's perspective, if everyone on the panel has said, I agree with my colleague, well, okay, you've done what you needed to do for participation. But in order for the judges to really be able to use that category to the best that they can and to provide you with a score that actually is meaningful, they're now going to be encouraged to take into account the whole breadth of discussion and the depth of your discussion as well. So over the course of your follow-up, for example, have you successfully built on each other's arguments? Have you successfully, referenced back to something you said in your opening statement? So, have the judges been able to ask you questions of greater and greater depth? So they were looking for a way to be able to define that better than saying, yes, we heard, I agree with my colleague 4 times. So those are the differences that you can expect to come out.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one quick question. I've
Yeah.
always wondered how you guys choose like the sources for like the questions, because I feel like it's always like you never know like where it's coming. Like it could be from a book that was published last year. It could be from a court case from like 100 years ago. Like how do you guys like decide the sources?
Absolutely, that's such a good question. And there's several different answers. So the first thing, the way that we approach the questions, the first thing we do is think about broad topics that we haven't necessarily done recently. So there are a lot of folks, yourselves included, that have done this for a number of years, and teachers have done this for a number of years. We try to kind of keep it fresh, so we're not always asking the same subject matter questions every time. So once we have kind of the broad subject matter, then we have a committee of question writers, and they get to work and they start drafting what they want to do. And sometimes it depends on their professional experience and their expertise. So there are sometimes sources that they really like and they want to get into. So for example, last year, the question that was the Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote, like that was from one of the question writers that they just really, really wanted to ask about that. So like, great, let's do it. And then other times we come up with the general, the question first, and then go backwards and look and see if there's a case or a quote that is a nice lead in to that particular subject. So it can kind of go in both directions, depending on who the committee members are in any given year. But the one thing we really do try to do is make sure that whatever source they're after is easily accessible. So we try specifically not to make sure like you have to have a Wall Street Journal account in order to read this article, or this is a book that's so archaic that no library in North America has it. So yeah, we try to make sure it's at least easily findable.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? These are great.
Yeah, especially any current students, please don't be shy. Feel free to drop it in the chat. I know, volunteers are asking questions, but this is a really cool opportunity to get to talk to someone from the Center for Civic Education. So you don't always have that opportunity. So if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to drop it in. And thank you, Emily, so much for all the information and for spending your Saturday with us.
Oh, absolutely. I'm really happy to do it. And yeah, y'all have had great questions so far. So I know, for the students who haven't necessarily gone through it quite yet, you might not necessarily know what question to ask, but yeah, it'll be a really fun experience, and I'm glad y'all are going to do it.
I might ask maybe on behalf of the students, if you had, if you were to give some advice to students who are just starting, that we've had one summer session previously, they've done some research here and there, but it's still very new to them. If you had some advice to give them at this stage of of the We the People process, what would it be?
I would say, first of all, try to have fun with it as much as you can. Like, I know it's a competition, and I know it's definitely a lot of work, but try to have fun with it as much as you can. Because, as you see from all the volunteers, the experience of going through this with your classmates is a life-changing one. And that's largely built on a fun opportunity, not something that is terrible and scary. So we all really try to make this as fun as we can. In terms of your preparation, I mean, I usually think that the more broadly you start, that it can actually help, because there's so many different source materials and so many different ideas that you might have. I know it's really easy to look at some of the questions and like get kind of really, really narrow really fast. Like, okay, this is a quote from John Adams. Let's dig into the papers of John Adams. Like, yes, you should still do that. But there's always like a broader theme. And I think it's a good idea to try to read at that broader level first, because it's going to bring in the opportunity for more interesting references, more interesting cases that will demonstrate to the judges, like, I not only understand the specific source, I understand the issue or the question at large. So I always like to suggest start broad, work your way down.
Oh, Gianni, were you coming in with a question? Please feel
Yeah,
free.
I was gonna ask like a follow-up question to Clint's question. It's obviously like a very like research intensive like competition. I was wondering, what are your favorite like research resources? Like, I feel like everyone has their own like that they've developed over time. If you have like any specific ones, you're like, these are the ones I always recommend.
Well, okay, so for sure, oye.com. So that's, if you're looking for a case example, that's the easiest possible way you're going to find it. And it has the synopsis of each of the cases. And I love that source in general. That's great. Another one I love is Akil Rita Mar's The Constitution and Biography. So, if you're looking for the Constitution specific examples, that is the most plain language book I have ever come across that really kind of helps you understand, oh, right, that's what this text means. So I love that, really, really helpful. And then depending on which unit you're in, I mean, having a Federalist or anti-Federalist writing in your back pocket, you can never go wrong there. So yeah, those are my top three. That's a great question.
Fantastic. Well, I think that kind of brings us to the end of the time that we had allocated here with Emily today, but I am so grateful for you taking the time to come and chat with us and with the students. Thank you for everything you do with CCE.
Sure, absolutely. And if you all have questions, or if you do want to volunteer at some point in the future, as I said, my email is in the chat, and I would be happy to answer any questions later on. So thank you all so much for doing this. We'll look forward to seeing you in DC.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Alrighty. So last time when we were here for summer session, we went over a little bit about how a hearing works and what some of the structure and things to know about that were. That was a little bit ago. It's also summer, and it's also a lot of new information. So we're going to take just a quick moment to do a little review of that. So I'm going to turn it over to Zoe.
Yeah, all right. So you guys should have had access to this document from last session. I'm going to drop it in the chat again. And then I'm also going to share my screen. There we go. Should be shared. Great. Hope everyone can see my screen okay. I'll run through this fairly quickly. I remember when I first started Comp Civics ages ago, I thought that the 6 units were super overwhelming and that I would never keep track of them. So the explanation on this document is fairly straightforward, but the way that I like to think about it is that Unit 1 is essentially foundational political, constitutional philosophy, political theory. Unit 2 being a bit more historical from the founding era, a lot of work and analysis and discussion of like the Federalist Papers or Madison's notes from the convention. Unit 3 being a lot more heavy on like the 14th Amendment and equal protection. Unit 4 being more bureaucratic, the 3 branches of government and how checks and balances play with each other. Unit 5 generally being kind of like the Supreme Court, almost like a lawyer sort of unit. They're discussing a lot of case law, a lot of jurisprudence, and Unit 6 being current events. Each of these units, like, they're going to have their specialty with the types of evidence and the types of information topics that they discuss, but fundamentally a strong team overall is going to have a little bit of everything in every single unit. And that's kind of where this pagoda, like Greek statue temple format kind of comes from. Unit 1, like I said, being the historical and philosophical foundations of government, is the basis for the writing of the Constitution. And from there, the Constitution is the basis for everything that we're going to be talking about, including the framing era. And there's a distinct difference between the founders and the framers, which eventually we'll get to talk about once you guys really get the ball rolling. Again, Unit 3 being voting, due process, equal protection, is generally more seated in the Civil War era. Unit 4, institutions of the US government, the 3 branches of government. Unit 5, the Bill of Rights, kind of, again, where a lot of the case law and jurisprudence comes from. And all of this synergizes into the broader discussion of the citizen society in a globalized world. Otherwise, just a lot of current events happening. I also just want to reiterate that, again, every single unit is going to have to talk about everything else happening. You're going to have your strengths and your weaknesses, but Unit 1 cannot not talk about current events. Unit 5 can't not talk about the philosophy behind the Constitution. So just kind of as you go into selecting your units and start really thinking more seriously about we the people, don't try to funnel yourself into one that you think you're going to be the best at. Really, in order to excel in we the people, you're going to have to be a jack of all trades. Moving on to the basic congressional hearing structure. There's a nice little flow chart here. So it starts with introductions. These are going to be pretty rehearsed by the and down pat by the time you are competing at the state or national level. Each school and each team is going to do their introductions differently, but generally proceeds where the judges introduce themselves, the students introduce themselves in their, seated order, and then the judges tell the question that they're working on. Sometimes you know the question, sometimes you don't. Once you get to the higher levels, you don't really know what question you're going to get asked. And there's a note that this section isn't timed. The timer starts once the first speaker starts speaking, and this is going to be the bulk of a lot of your work between testimony and Q&A. Testimony is a prepared statement that you're going to read off of or maybe have memorized. Testimony is going to be 4 minutes, and there's a pretty hard stop. Would recommend that you time your testimony before presenting it officially for about 3 minutes, 50 seconds, 3:55, give or take a little bit for speaking a little faster, a little slower. This testimony is going to be in response to the question posed. You're going to have your testimony prepared ahead of time, and each question has an overall question and then 2 sub questions, and you're expected to answer all 3 of these questions in their entirety. And a lot of the tweaking that you'll be spending for the next year is going to be on your testimony. Following the 4-minute testimony, we move into the Q&A. Depending on the competition, Q&A can be either, up to 6 or I think sometimes 12 or 10 minutes. Generally at districts, regionals, and state though, I believe Q&A is going to be 8 minutes. Anyone else from CACE can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's where it is. So at first, the 8 minutes is going to feel like a long time because you're still kind of figuring out what to talk about. But soon, once you are in a rhythm, 8 minutes passes by really, really quickly. Generally, the reminder that I would like to share about Q&A is that you're presenting an argument in your testimony, and your Q&A is a place for you to defend that argument. The judges are going to want to hear more about what you have to say. There might be something interesting that the judges pick up on, and you should be able to have an educated, intellectual, very persuasive conversation with the judges about it. We kind of mentioned participation earlier. It should be fairly balanced participation for each question. Overall, every single person on your unit should be pulling their weight, and Q&A should be very balanced. This is where a good unit is separated from a great unit. Q&A is like meant to be a really engaging discourse, and where you bring in like your really show-stopping evidence, really show the judges that you know what you're talking about and you genuinely believe in what you're talking about. And then after the 6 to 10 minutes, usually 8 minutes is up, we move into feedback, especially at our practice sessions in class and at like regionals, and maybe not so much states, but there's going to be a lot more feedback, especially in class, when you're going to be able to tweak your Q&A, get feedback for both your testimony and Q&A. The judges are going to be talking about a bunch of different things. I would highly, highly recommend that you take notes during feedback. Sometimes like different judges have different philosophies and they may be contradicting each other. My advice is just kind of feel what's right with your gut, like still listen to the judges. But I mean, at the end of the day, you know what you're doing. And as a unit, you should be working together to decide what's best ultimately for your unit. And then here's a cute little, diagram of the layout. It's just going to be the panel of judges facing the panel of students. And then there's going to be a timer seated somewhere. Again, as you kind of progress throughout the competition, you'll figure out how you're going to introduce yourselves. You're going to figure out who's your timer and really get a lot more comfortable with the presentation style. Let me know if I missed anything or if anyone has any questions. You guys, again, do have reference to this document. And again, this can feel like a lot of information, but once you get into the practice of Comp Civics and We the People, this really becomes like second nature to you. I mean, like several years out, I'm still it's still very ingrained in my head. And then I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Does anyone have any questions at the moment? I kind of talked quickly, but yeah, let me know.
I will also say real fast, if you're here and you didn't come to summer session 1, which totally understandable, it's summer vacation, you may have had other plans. But if anything's feeling a little confusing, we recorded it, and that recording was sent to you. We'll make sure that the recording of this gets sent to you as well. So you can go back and review that as well. If there's anything that's like, oh, I missed the first time they talked about this, we have that available for you.
Yeah. And again, once you start the school year and start practicing, this will all become a lot clearer because you're not in it right now. So don't feel like, you have to know everything at the moment. This is just kind of give you a little bit of a precursor to everything that you're going to do this year.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any questions right now, but if they do pop up in chat, we will turn it back over to Zoe and have some answers on that. But what we're going to do up next is continue our conversation about the score sheet. So last time during summer session 1, we talked about the first 3 elements of the score sheet. And today we're going to finish out the conversation about the score sheet. In the agenda that you were sent, it says understanding. We talked about understanding last time. So we're actually talking about today its constitutional application, the evidence part, and then the reasoning. And we'll talk a little bit more about types of evidence further on in today's session, but Tom is going to give us an overview of the score sheet.
Yeah. So I'm going to drop the link to the score sheet that I'm going to be sharing. It's also going to be on my screen. So if anybody wants to reference it on their own computer, that's also totally fine. But I also have it here on my screen. So as Katie mentioned, we are going to be covering constitutional application, reasoning, and supporting evidence today. I'm actually going to do this in reverse order just because I think it makes it a little bit more intuitive. And I'll also stop after every category just so everybody has a chance to ask any questions, or if any CACE volunteers want to add any comments about the categories. So yeah, starting off with supporting evidence, I think that this category specifically it's applied to both the testimony and Q&A. That's applicable to every single one of these categories. But specifically, I think you can split this up further into kind of 2 metrics or 2 categories. The first is diversity of evidence, and the second is responsiveness of your evidence. So we're going to talk a bit more about the types of evidence, and Zoe's going to do a little bit of a deep dive in that later on in the CACE session today. But in terms of diversity of evidence, we really want to have a diverse amount of both the type of evidence and then the content of evidence. So whether it's legislation, court cases, law review articles, news, or even just a personal anecdote, judges are really looking for a diverse amount of evidence that you're applying to both your testimony, whether it's how you're using a court case to support a specific claim that you're making in your testimony, or you're using a piece of evidence such as news or a Federalist paper within your Q&A answers. And so you really want to create that image of yourself of having this diverse background of evidence that you're pulling from, and that demonstrates understanding and also just an overall knowledge of whatever you're talking about, whatever concept you're talking about. The other part of that is content. And so within a diversity of evidence, it's also important to consider different perspectives, whether that's Federalist or anti-Federalist, a political party versus another political party, state level, federal level, or even a global level. That's kind of what we're looking for in terms of diversity of evidence within your support. But also the other aspect of supporting evidence that I personally find a lot of units might struggle with in the beginning when they're trying to just cram everything into their brains and understand all of these different types of evidence that are relevant to their unit and whatever content they're talking about, is responsiveness of evidence. And so your evidence that you're using both in Q&A and also in your testimony has to be applicable to whatever question you're answering or whatever claim you're making. And so we talked about responsiveness in our last case session, but this is a little bit separate. I feel like this is more relevant to whenever you're talking about evidence and making sure it's relating to your claim. And so this more responsiveness is more about helping your evidence support your claim or your main answer. So for example, if a judge asks a question, are apples better than oranges? And you respond with, yes, apples are better than oranges. And this is because bananas are easier to peel. While your claim is responsive to whatever question that judge is asking, your evidence is completely unrelated or doesn't respond to help you prove that claim. And so that's another aspect or another dimension of this category that is really important to know early on. And it's definitely not this cut and dry. And as Emily mentioned, there's a lot of overlap between these different categories. But in terms of understanding this category of supporting evidence, I think that's a great way to kind of put it. Another part of the supporting evidence that's really important is that whenever you're explaining a piece of evidence, whether it's in testimony or in Q&A, judges are looking at you extracting the piece of that evidence that's relevant to whatever you're talking about, whatever your argument is. And so being able to accurately summarize your evidence and summarize that piece of evidence that you're referencing in a way that's actually relevant to the context of what you're speaking about. And this again applies for both written testimony and your Q&A. And yeah, if anybody has any questions about that category, I can go ahead and answer them right now. If not, we can move on. If any case volunteers have anything to add, that's fine too. Great. So the next category is going to be reasoning. And then reasoning kind of ties into this supporting evidence category. Reasoning specifically is how are you supporting all of your claims, whether it's in testimony or in Q&A, in order to answer the questions that judges are asking you. That can be the testimony question or questions within Q&A. And so it examines kind of how you are able to prove or support your point, and how to prove to your audience that whatever claim you're making is the correct or end all be all. And you can obviously qualify and make refutations to your positions, but reasoning is really the way that you're kind of able to express your understanding of these topics and express your ability to create a line of solid reasoning. And so good reasoning within this category would be either conceding or refuting to potential counter arguments. It can also be explaining what aspect of your evidence specifically proves your position to be true. And a good process to look at when trying to gain these evidence or these reasoning points is to walk your judges through exactly what your thought process is. This event or ruling or process or piece of legislation has X impact, and X impact proves that my claim that B is true. that kind of process is really, really important to allow yourself to walk your judges through your line of reasoning and make your claim and evidence and argumentation just stronger. And also in Q&A, it's kind of what saves you whenever you are asked about something that's maybe not in your comfort zone, something that you haven't researched super in depth. Evidence and reasoning combined together is a really great way for you to kind of pivot that conversation and still gain a lot of points within those categories. And I think reasoning is something that a lot of units struggle with in the beginning. Sometimes it's easy to hear a question or be drafting testimony and come up with a concrete claim, like a yes or a no answer. But then when you apply your evidence, you kind of just leave it there. You kind of leave your evidence and then don't have any reasoning to kind of support why your evidence proves that point. And this reasoning category kind of just comes with a greater understanding as you research, as you increase your base of knowledge within your concepts, within your unit, within kind of just a bigger overall macro view and understanding of government. I think this reasoning kind of comes more naturally. So it's something that is definitely harder to grasp at first, but it's super important in the long run, and it'll come with a lot of research and just talking with your unit. Any questions about that reasoning category? Okay. So then the last category that we're going to be kind of talking about is constitutional application. I think constitutional application is something that kind of transcends all of these different categories, whether it's responsiveness, supporting evidence, reasoning, understanding. It's kind of how you're able to tie all of the things that you're talking about back to the Constitution. And this commonly can be done with citations. So within the body of the Constitution, a specific article number, section number, clause number, an amendment, but it can also be done with court cases, with founding documents, whether that's Federalist Papers or other types of these constitutional principles or documents within constitutional history. These pieces of evidence allow you to demonstrate that you're able to connect these broader and more potentially more modern or more removed concepts back to the Constitution. Because at the core of We the People or competition civics, the Constitution is kind of what all of our units are branching off of. As Zoe mentioned, Unit 1 is kind of the foundation, Unit 2 is the formation of the Constitution, and then Unit 3, 4, 5, and 6 are kind of how that Constitution has changed over time. And so personally, I think that constitutional application is something that is honestly very easy to identify those connections, but remembering and being conscious about making those connections back to the Constitution is something that should really be at the forefront of when you're drafting testimony or answering questions in Q&A. And then in terms of tips and how to get this application point, my biggest tip is just to try to figure out where within testimony and Q&A that you can cite the Constitution, but also understanding kind of the process of ratification, how different philosophers have contributed to different constitutional principles, and then also understanding different interpretations. A great way to do this is through case law, because the job and role of the Supreme Court is to interpret the Constitution. And so by referencing them, you are demonstrating an understanding of different interpretations of constitutional principles. And so that's kind of my biggest tip in terms of trying to get that constitutional application point. One thing I would want to highlight though is that Unit 1 and Unit 6, because they're less directly connected with the Constitution, Unit 1 is primarily focused on philosophy, and Unit 6 can often be very international or modern day. People within these units should very much keep constitutional application as a forefront within working and kind of going through the process of writing testimony and answering Q&A. But yeah, any questions about that category or anything CACE volunteers would like to add?
Great job, Tom. I think that I would echo everything that you said. I just really want to underline and highlight kind of the last thing that you mentioned. Judging Unit 1 and Unit 6 specifically, it is often, and it has been very recently, the difference between coming in first and second in that unit as to whether or not you hit that constitutional application score. So it's just, it'll take a while to get before it's comfortable, but it's one of those things that you just have to remind yourself to shoehorn in.
Yeah, definitely. Any other questions or anything to add? And this can also be about any of these categories. Yeah. Okay.
Alrighty. Doesn't seem like it. I just quick temperature check in terms of the students, because y'all have been quiet so far, and it's okay if it's just like absorbing a lot of information is a big ask, especially on a Saturday morning. But I just want to make sure, is everyone still doing okay, feeling good? If you want to drop it in the chat, maybe just, you know, if you're feeling tired, that's one thing, but we just want to make sure we're not, you know, overwhelming. If there's anything that you want clarification on, we do actually want to hear from you. It's really important, especially when we're over Zoom. It's a little harder for us to tell if there's stuff that's like a little confusing or stuff that's moving too fast. So please feel free to drop in chat. Feel free to, you know, give us some sort of reaction so we know that you're doing okay. Perfect. Okay. With that, we are going to turn over. I enjoy the just slash reaction. Thank you. You're out there. Got a thumbs up. Okay, we're doing okay. Heart reaction. Okay, fabulous. It's just good to hear from you. And please feel free to use the chat throughout. I know there's specific points for people who have asked for questions, but you're welcome to drop questions in the chat when they come to mind. That's one of the great parts of being here in a virtual platform, is it's not interrupting to drop things in chat. It's actually really helpful and really engaging. So please don't be afraid to do that. With that, thank you so much, Tom, for doing that overview. I'm really excited to turn it over to another special guest who's going to be giving us some great information. So I'm going to give her a chance to introduce herself.
Y'all, I'm Mari Woolgamuth, or Mrs. Woolgamuth, or Woogie, if you know me from Amador. So I have been working with the We the People, woohoo, for a long time, right, Clint? So 20 plus years. I teach at Amador, and I teach AP US History, and this year also English Language Learners US History. Woo woo. So I am super excited to give you just kind of a quick little lecturette on classical republicanism. And then later on today, I'll be doing the natural rights philosophers for you. So first off, thank you so much, CACE, for inviting me. This is, I think, maybe the second or so time that I've done this, and it's something I look forward to. It gives a closure to the summer and a launching pad to the school year. But it's always such a pleasure to see the names. I'll just say the names because, hi, y'all, you don't have your cameras on. So, you know, it's just a little PTSD bringing me back to online teaching that I don't know. Like, is there a pulse check? Katie tried to take one, right? Huh? Let's take that little pulse check. So hopefully you're all out there and now you're awake. And let's get into what some people think is boring. I do not. I am in love with Unit 1. And that's one reason why I wanted to thank CACE for asking me to do this, because I love Unit 1. So I'm going to share my screen if I know how to do this still. So we can all see, yeah? Got a thumbs up that we can see. I hope. Awesome. Okay, so this is the topic of Unit 1, and that is what are the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system? And we're going to start with backing up there. Your first question. So when you prepare for district and regionals, you're going to be preparing 3 different prompts. And this is your first prompt if you're in Unit 1. So it starts with, how were the founders' views about government influenced by both classical republicanism and natural rights philosophers? So that's your overall heading question. And then your sub questions are, what are the essential differences between classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy? So you give a little like T-chart, right? And then your second follow-up is, how do those differences appear in America's founding documents? So when we talk about founding documents, kind of your go-to are going to be the Declaration of Independence, the state constitutions, the early state constitutions, and of course the Constitution itself. But those are just your go-tos. There's others that you can dig up, essays. You could use something like Thomas Paine's Common Sense as a founding document. So that's just kind of like our, overall go-to, the three types. So both. Remember I said like T-chart, little Venn diagram? If we were looking at the center of a Venn diagram, we would see the similarities between these two. They both speak about human nature. They both have what they believe is the purpose of politics. And then they also have what is good government, what is bad government. So the political philosophies that influence the framers are usually divided into two groups. So that's where we kind of start off with the classical republicanism and natural rights philosophers. So it's not like one founder, let's say like Alexander Hamilton, had a view of just classical republicanism. Of course, their views are kind of melding both of these viewpoints. And so it's our job to kind of unpack those viewpoints and have an understanding of how they're different, how they're similar, and then get into the writings of those founders and the founding documents to see where we see evidence of these two philosophies. So the main idea for classical republicanism is going to be that, like, first off, you're going to see polis a lot, P-O-L-I-S, that's the people. So that the people, or like the supremacy of the state. Classical republicanism is very focused on the community as a whole, and the excellence of the people themselves, not individuals, but the groups, like a groupthink type of thing, really highly respecting civic virtue. And that's kind of where you might see a little overlap with natural rights, because natural rights is like the individual, but think of like civic virtue is what the individual chooses to do and behave like, and it's a very high, level of being an upstanding citizen. The whole idea is what is best for the community. What is the common good? What is best for that common good? It's not about my individual rights. It's about what's best for the entire flock, so to speak. So you generally will see in history examples of classical republicanism in very homogeneous groups. When you have a very diverse group, it's a little more difficult to kind of have a group think that what they all agree is good for the entire community. So that's something to kind of like, put on the back burner of like, if the communities are very much alike, you probably have more success in a classical Republican nature than you do in a very diverse or a very large society. And then natural rights, just the main idea there is there is the person, like the individual rights. They look at the fundamental rights, life, liberty, property, and sovereignty, like who holds the power. Think of the word sovereignty as like power. Who holds the power in natural rights? It's the people. The people consent to the government, and they have a say in the government. They're like, we the people. Hello, name of the program, right? We the people is that's the sovereign group. And of course, the idea of the social contract, that you would enter into this contract with the government. But as contracts go, perhaps there's also the ability to break that contract if those rights are being violated. So here are kind of our go-to classical republicanists. We got the philosophies of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and St. Thomas. And so when you look at their views on human nature, again, you look at the word polis. The idea is that God created, and there's another similarity. Both of these philosophies will have the acknowledgement of a supreme being, of God created humans. And with classical republicanism, God created humans with reason and with the ability to speak. And that's what separates them from the other animals in the animal kingdom. So that kind of basis is like, y'all are special because you're human. You can reason and you can speak. And in that idea that you should be able to speak well, you can kind of imagine that, I wonder if that means education is really important. Yes, it is. To educate the populace in order for you to have those abilities of reason and to speak, maybe not everyone speaking eloquently, but to be able to defend your ideas. So the polis, like the people, will thrive when the citizens have good habits, virtue, and civic devotion. So I kind of highlighted that on this slide for you to really see it pop out: habits, virtue, devotion. Okay, so we move into the purpose of politics. So what classical Republicans think the purpose of politics is that in small, self-contained communities, people can achieve excellence and happiness. So again, I underline that for an emphasis of small, self-contained communities. So I know it's not the greatest, like, us talking via Zoom, but I'm hoping that you can kind of come up with perhaps in your mind an example of where in the founding of the United States, we had small, self-contained communities. And if you are thinking, the colonies, you're right. Okay, so when we just look at the founding of the colonies, you can kind of come up with examples of like, yeah, I guess like Massachusetts Bay Colony was kind of a small self-contained community. Well, at first, yeah, it was. The purpose of politics is also to promote civic virtue. It's for enlightened self-interest. So do you see how there's still an element of like what it means for the individual in the community? It's not all just the colony itself. It is what the individual can bring, but the individual has a high bar to bring to them, like to the community, their best. What are they best at? And that's going to elevate the community. And you also have the purpose of politics here is to have a strong defense, which I also will see a little bit of an overlap with particularly one of our natural rights philosophers of maintaining a strong defense. That when you look at the core of like, what is government? What is the purpose of government? It would be for them to protect us. It could be individual rights if it's natural rights philosophy, or it could be to protect the state with classical republicanism. So what is good government? Good government for classical republicanism, small self-contained communities. They have a proper balance among the members themselves. Everyone is contributing something to the society. There is a very heavy focus on education, and that you would have a wise, deliberative rule that let's say if you do have a king, that king or that the head of state is going to be virtuous, is going to be wise, is going to be doing the best for what is best for the community. So then we kind of, look at the comparison here with bad government. So what do classical Republicans think of bad government? When one's passions are uncontrolled. When you don't have that self-control, it could be individuals or a group is not controlled. So you need to keep the passions under control. There is a preoccupation with material goods or pleasures. So like gluttony, no, not part of a good government there. If there's poor civic and personal virtue, you notice that in classical republicanism, the onus is on the citizen to contribute, and they need to contribute. You can't just like, I don't feel like it and walk off. Like, you have to actually contribute to that society. And then bad government also would be seen in self-interested rulers. The ruler is supposed to be doing what's best for the entire group. So which principles of classical republicanism can I expect to find in our founding documents? So again, as I said just a few minutes before, here are kind of our go-to. We're going to look at the Declaration of Independence. You're going to look at early state constitutions. And I really want to emphasize early state constitutions because I think a lot of us, like our gut is just to go Declaration of Independence, Constitution of the United States, and not think of like, wait a minute, we did have a federalist form of government with the Constitution of the US. That means that there's levels of government and all the states had their own constitutions as well, their own state constitutions. So we really look at those actual documents. Another kind of heads up with the state constitutions is just look at the dates. If the dates are 1776 and on, that's an early state constitution. If they're before 1776, then it's probably a colonial charter. And there's sometimes not a whole lot of difference between those two because many of the colonies, when they declared independence, just went to their charter and kind of like, you know, cut and paste. Of course, they're not cutting and pasting, but you know what I mean? I mean, they're like cutting out like the king. And some of them are saying, no, we're not going to have an executive. And some say, yeah, we are going to have an executive. And they're just kind of like modifying the terminology. So there's not necessarily a huge shift in what you see from the colonial charter to the early state constitutions. And then you also will see the state constitutions, they're kind of changing them a little frequently from 1776 into the early 1800s. And then, of course, there is also an American document that's not here, like reading between the lines. I'm hoping that you're saying like, oh, that's right, the Articles of Confederation. So you can definitely look into the articles, especially when you want to look at examples for classical republicanism. Go to. So early state governments, the examples that you might see in their constitutions would be uniformity. There might be a lot of mention of religious and racial and ethnic uniformity. So some really great go-tos would be, you could go to Connecticut, you could go to like any of the New England, go to Massachusetts for sure. Rigorous citizenship requirements, having that you actually have to own land, that you have to be an upstanding community member in order to have voting rights, to have suffrage. And you generally will see small communities or small regions. So look at like the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. That document combines several areas of Connecticut into one. The main reason they did that was to defend themselves against Indian attacks. But that's one example, again, an early document that you can look at when you're doing some of your research for Unit 1. And then civic virtue, again, is emphasized. Everyone has to participate somehow in the community. So here are just a couple examples from state constitutions. So here's Massachusetts. The happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend on piety, religion, and morality. Those words should be popping out of like, that's a good example of classical republicanism. And then in Pennsylvania, a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles and a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, industry, and frugality are absolutely necessary to preserve the blessings of liberty and keep a government free. And then we'll look at the Constitution. Where do you see elements of classical republicanism? Great way to go is to look at the preamble. Look at the Senate, look at eligibility requirements of like age, how long they have to have lived in the United States. Do they have to be a citizen or not? All of those eligibility requirements for representatives in the Senate or in the House, that's going to give you some examples of classical republicanism. And then, of course, the powers that were left to the states. So the powers left to the states are going to give you an example of how there's individuality between the federal government and the state governments, but a lot of the onus is on the states of like, hey, you still have to have a Republican rule of government. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and ask if there are any questions before we go on to break. And look at that, I'm only 1 minute over. Whoop, whoop. Okay, if there's no questions, I'll hand it back over to CACE and I'll see you guys in a little bit.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was incredible and some really good information. I hope that was helpful for students in terms of giving an overview of some of those concepts. We'll be touching on the rest of it in a little bit. Real fast, we're going to just take like a 5-minute bio breaks to take a moment, grab some, but be back here right around 11:11. So be there or be square. We'll see you soon. Okay, awesome. Thank you all so much. And we are back to continue summer session 2. So what we're going to do now is kind of like last time where we had a panel of some alumni come and do one of our, kind of a mock question and show you how some of that works. We're going to do that again with a different question this time. So if I can have everyone that's on the panel or joining the panel be on video and everyone else not be on video. Thank you.
So Katie, are you judging with me?
I'm happy to judge with you.
Wonderful. Fabulous. And is this the full panel?
I think we might be missing Nicolette.
Yeah.
Let me give her a quick text.
Perfect.
So for folks who came last week, we had a group of alumni do a testimony and Q&A on the We the People program in general. This time we're going to be doing it about some substantive discussions. This is pretty close to what you're going to see at the what I would say the regional and state level competitions, where you're going to have a pre-written testimony, and then we're going to do 8 minutes of Q&A. By the way, if there is another CACE volunteer who wants to be a third judge, you are welcome to jump in. But one thing that I want to highlight and really want to appreciate is we just heard a great discussion about classical republicanism and, fulfilling collective responsibilities, civic virtue. All of our recent alumni volunteers did this program within the last 2 years. They're not getting credit for this. This is just sort of a validation of classical republicanism. It's very cool. We appreciate it. So we have looks like four folks. Nicolette keeps dropping off. So I know that we've introduced. Okay, Rashab is going to jump in as a third judge. Wonderful. Okay. So ordinarily in a competition, you're going to be sitting, as we saw the diagram, the judges are going to be on one table, the panel is going to be on another table. We've all already introduced ourselves, but we're going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves again. Then I'm going to read the question. We have a timer. Is there a timer? Somebody who can time? Somebody who's not judging? Oh, now it says my internet connection is a little unstable. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
You were a little shaky for a second, but you're fine now.
Okay, great. Is there a timer? Can somebody time?
If you need me to time, I can time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mari.
All right, you're doing 4 and 8.
4 and 8.
Okay.
Okay. So folks who want to introduce yourselves?
Good morning. We are the alumni panel from the alumni. My name is Gianni Chidipodu. I'd like to thank our judges today for listening to us.
My name is Caden Garofalo.
My name is Gordon Moe.
My name is and my name is Nicolette Penn. We would like to thank the judges, timekeeper, and audience today. And yes, okay.
Great. So the question today is, how do America's founding documents reflect a classical Republican commitment to civic duties? In what way do they fail to do so? You may begin when you're ready.
The Declaration of Independence reflects the people's civic virtue to overthrow a tyrannous government and have the right to self-govern. Plato writes in his Republic that when a people face tyranny, they may have a moral obligation to overthrow the government. Plato's idea of philosopher rulers to look after the welfare of the state is reflected by the Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence reflects a group of philosopher rulers looking after the welfare of the state by separating from Great Britain. In doing so, they even state facts and reasoning for that separation. A group of thinkers so greatly invested in the new country's future reflected the civic duty to help a community recently displaced from position as the colonies.
But when it came to the US Constitution, framers borrowed classical Republican ideas of aristocracy and mixed government. In the Republic 375 BCE, Plato identifies aristocracy as the ideal form of government. Article 1, Section 3 of the US Constitution mirrored this, creating a Senate of elite representatives elected by state legislatures. This idea was that this government structure would allow the most good to be done for the most people, thus exemplifying their civic duty.
Adversely, we see that the idea of popular participation was dominant in Article 1, Section 2. Although Aristotle did support the idea of aristocracy as the ideal form of government, he also mentions that popular participation is important to ensure the freedom of the people, and that without it, it leaves the people to be exploited by the government. The idea of proportional representation inside the House allows the people not only to exercise civic virtue, but also, in theory, encourages them to be politically educated.
It is also one's duty to protect political society from the fallibility of man. To exercise civic duty as well as possible, classical Republican thinker Aristotle examined the role of law as a way to do so. He believed that when laws are not sovereign, the people become a monarch. The Declaration of Independence asserts that government must have a foundation of principles, or rather laws, and must derive their powers from the consent to govern. An arbitrary government would be straying from their commitment to civic duty, and so the founders constructed an idea of government in their founding documents to avoid this. The US government focused more firmly on natural rights than classical Republican commitments, however. On the other hand, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was more deliberate with its wording, as its purpose as written was to ensure to secure the existence of the body politic and to protect it.
We can see that early state constitutions supported the idea of being politically active mainly through voting for representatives. However, this was mainly a right afforded to landed white men, especially through Article 1, Section 4, which left much of the voting procedure to the states. There were some exceptions with the New Jersey Constitution of 1776, as it implied some women could vote. They were later the first state in 1790 to formally give women the right to vote, which increased the number of people who were committed to their civic duty of voting.
On the state levels as a whole, we see a larger push for civic virtue. Benjamin Rush, a popular politician in Pennsylvania, pushed very strongly for education and the idea of patriotism. He outlines an education plan for this in 1786, in which he says, "Let him be taught to love his family, but let him be taught at the same time that he must forsake and even forget them when the welfare of the country requires it." While Benjamin Rush's idea may have been extreme, it exemplifies how during the early times of our union, we see a larger push on the states to try to protect the common good. However, we'd like to point out that the issue of slavery at the Constitution was not exactly brought up. And so when we talk about the common good, it is most likely to reflect the common good of white, rich landowning men, rather than the entirety common good of the community as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned that the Senate was sort of a reflection of classical Republican theology, or theory rather, that there should be rule by the elites. Do you think that it was a good idea for the founders to create the Senate based on that idea?
I think it was an important idea to explore, but I think in reality, it wasn't exactly implemented in a correct way. I think the issue that came up immediately as we see the Senate grow is that the Senate was starting to become very corrupt. We saw that with the addition of the 17th Amendment. What ended up happening is just almost like elite bribery of state legislatures and more like political persuasion to get elected to the Senate. So I don't think they entirely accounted for how corrupt that system could have been. And instead, but we do see that with the addition of the 17th Amendment, they were able to fix it.
I agree with Caden, but I don't think that means our Senate is entirely hopeless. And I think the founders did have a vision for our Senate. And this can be not just reflected in our government where they wanted to be have an elite body, but we can look to parliamentary governments where there is where we do see an elite body also participating in the government. However, for example, if we take England, they have more checks and balances that control the power of the Senate and ensure that they don't collect a lot of power.
Spoken to testimony about the common good being limited to a small portion of the population at the time of the founding. In what ways has that transformed, and in what ways do we still have gaps in terms of who is considered, to qualify under the common good?
The greatest way that the idea of the common good being only for small people has transformed is through amendments to the Constitution, which expanded and protected voting for more people. For example, the 15th Amendment, which prevented race for in a consideration for like who can vote, as well as the 19th Amendment, which included women all across America, which greatly expanded the voting populace and thus who participated in government.
Yeah, we can also see in many state constitutions, for example, the South Carolina Constitution of 1778, there was the idea that no free man could be judged, they could only be judged by their peers. And now we can see that today very obviously in the Constitution, and how we have the right to a fair trial. And so we have more representation for the common good if we kind of include more people in what a free man is. And that definitely has changed from the founding era to now.
I just wanted to build off of this last question. The last question was kind of about how has the notion of the common good changed to include more groups over time. Do you think that today there are still some groups that are excluded from our idea of the common good, and what would be the best way to include them?
Yes, I think there definitely is a lot of groups that are actually exploited and not exactly included entirely in the common good. I would like to point to a good example, which I think is like ex-felons. Ex-felons don't exactly are treated differently, and some are not hired because they were, where they were in jail for a certain period of time, and it becomes very difficult to promote a large group of people who have been incarcerated and to kind of get them back into the workings of society. We also see that within prisons, we see a lot of like misuse of power, and most importantly, a lot of brutality inside of prisons that is not entirely fixed. And I think this a great way to be improving this is kind of to promote prisons to be kind of more of a reform rather than more of like a timeout, essentially is what it is now. And it doesn't actually fix the problem that it is supposed to address.
Moreover, another group that I think we really need to expand rights to would be citizens of Puerto Rico. If we look to past wars, we can see that citizens of Puerto Rico have a really high vested interest in our country through their really high draft rates. However, this isn't reflected in their actual participation of our government, as they aren't given a right to vote.
So in what ways, if any, does the Supreme Court, the idea of the Supreme Court, reflect classical Republican philosophy? Or is it more natural rights?
The Supreme Court is more based on the idea, especially of Plato and Aristotle, that a group of elite representatives can help the nation. And so that is very classical Republican concept. And you can see that very obviously when they make decisions for the good of the country, although we can see very differently now, but they're making decisions for the country as an elite group.
Alexander Hamilton actually defends this in his Federalist 78 when he defends many of the decisions surrounding the structure of the Supreme Court, such as their life term appointment, such as their ability. And because he and other Federalists feared the idea of a population getting too rowdy or too out of control, and thus saw the Supreme Court as a great counterbalance against any sort of overstepping by the people or by the government.
I also don't think that this is entirely separate. I think we have the Supreme Court seen kind of done both in a way. We've seen, for example, with cases like Miranda v. Arizona, they're promoting the common good by promoting individuals to have their own right and are promoting an individual's actual rights by allowing them to hear that they have the right to remain silent, they have the right to an attorney, and there are different amount of rights. But at the same time, you also argue it's a common good because it holds police accountable and it holds individuals more, it holds it allows more specific individuals to kind of hear what is happening and what options they have once they are arrested.
You touched a little bit on the topic of education in your testimony. What do you think is the role of education under a classical Republican ideal, and how was or wasn't that reflected in founding documents?
Education was not really prioritized in the founding documents. I think on a state level, more modern, we can see like there's been many educational initiatives, especially in California. I believe in Article 10, there is kind of the idea that we need more, we need education, and that's very important. However, in Plato, in the Republic, we can see that education is heavily emphasized, and especially for women as well. He did not necessarily discriminate in terms of education, that he decided that we need all women, men, and they all have the capacity for that education.
To add on to Nicolette, classical republicanism, may I finish my thought? Emphasizes education better than our modern government does.
All right. Really nice work there, guys. And so for folks who don't know, who are watching this, the panel didn't know what follow-up questions we were going to have. And you're never going to know for sure what follow-up questions we're going to have. So that's something, to keep in mind, that you heard them pull a wide variety of evidence, examples. We got Federalist Papers, we got Supreme Court cases, we got state constitutions, we got examples of amendments, several amendments to the Constitution. And they just kind of all had those ready to go because through their studies, through their research, they've been able to pick those things up and apply them to the Q&A portion. And so, it's just really impressive to see folks do that. It seems, if you're sitting there and you're like, I'm never going to be able to do that, I assure you, you will. It will just take some time. So in terms of feedback, I really liked your testimony. I liked how you got into the Senate, which is something that I think a lot of people miss as in terms of a classical Republican idea. The idea of rule by the elite is one thing that I think is not obvious necessarily. And so I appreciated that. I appreciate the sort of how you got into both federal and state constitutions. That's a way to hit that constitutional application score. You guys would have scored very high on constitutional application today. I would have liked to have heard a little bit more about how we failed to live up to classical Republican ideas, and why we failed, really. And I think the why we failed is really where you get the reasoning score on the score sheet, is because you talked about, well, we didn't talk about education as much, and the states were really focusing on classical Republican, and the federal government was focusing more on natural rights, but I didn't hear a why as much as I would have liked. But I really liked the Q&A. I thought you guys had great balance, great evidence, as I mentioned. Caden hit on something that I want everybody to keep in mind as we go forward and talk about natural rights for the rest of the session, is that oftentimes a way of promoting classical republicanism and the common good can also, if you look at it just from a different perspective, can be a way to promote natural rights as well. They are often two sides of the same coin, and often ways in which you try to promote the common good can also protect individual rights. I might have liked to have heard the idea of philosopher kings, which is very Platonic, when I asked my question about the Supreme Court. But other than that, I think it was excellent, and you all should be very proud. 100 civic virtue points for the panel. Katie?
Yeah, I would second a lot of the feedback you just got there. I think you did a really excellent job with this. I know you did not have a ton of time to pull this together, and I'm very impressed, with the fluidity with which you're able to talk about this topic. I would agree that the kind of conversation of why the failures are there is something that I would have appreciated a little bit more of, but I think we were able to cover some really interesting topics. I think that was a really good example for our current students of kind of some of the variety of things that can come up in Q&A, right? We had questions about the Senate, questions about the Supreme Court, questions that were about like comparing the past and the present, questions, that kind of like were a follow-up question on some of those topics. And that I think is an example of a really engaging and really interesting Q&A. And being able to do that is awesome. So for our current students that are watching this, that's something that you'll get there. It's not going to happen right away, but you'll get there. And it's really fun when we can get there and when we can really kind of bounce around and have some fun and talk about things. So thank you all so much for sharing your time and your energy with us on this. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I definitely echo what Katie and Clint have said. I think your guys' discussion of the historical evidence and underpinnings of all this was really, really good. I think maybe if you could touch on, I guess, a couple more as examples, I would have liked to see that a little bit more. I saw a little bit of it with, at times you were hinting at like, I think the Dobbs decision was vaguely referenced to, but, saying it explicitly wouldn't hurt at all. And that's always like a way to, improve your, diversity of evidence in general. If you can always bring something that's, recently happening, the judges will definitely like to see that, just as a general point for everyone. But overall, this was definitely very solid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so what we're going to do next is, I think, have some conversations about some types of evidence. Is there anything else we wanted to debrief from the alumni panel before we shift it over that way? Clint, do you have any other thoughts to share?
I don't. How are we on time?
We're doing good. Yeah, we have until, we've got plenty, we're good. Okay,
Yeah,
so
sure.
all right, so Zoe is going to come back and give us a presentation on some of the different types of evidence, which you had some really good examples of in practice from that alumni panel. So thank you again to the alumni.
Yeah, okay, perfect timing. I am going to drop a link again in the chat and then also share my screen again, same as last time. Here we go. Great. Okay, so really excellent timing with the kind of mock testimony we had just now, so you can get a feel for what I'm talking about in a more concrete way, and I'm not just kind of throwing words at you. So there's a document here that like has this breakdown of the types of evidence, but really like it's not really a formalized categorization. This is just kind of a way for you to understand it now. We keep saying this, but once you really get into the practice and really get good at what you're doing, it's not going to like be super categorical like this. This is just a way for you to kind of start at a base point right now as you start to build the kind of bank of evidence you have in your brain. So starting with philosophy, we've been talking about classical republicanism and natural rights. Generally, this would be a specific reference to philosophers' text. At a higher level, especially at nationals, the more specific you can get with your evidence, the better. So in the past, like when I competed at nationals, I remember one of the judges was super impressed because we were like, oh yeah, in chapter 36 of Rawls's, philosopher John Rawls's a theory of justice, so he said XYZ. So the more specific you can get with like specific quotations or chapters, numbers, things like that are really gonna impress the judges. Next, you have historical events and examples. Oh, back to philosophy though, really quick. Make sure that you're applying the philosophy or whatever piece of evidence that you have, and instead of just dropping it in your Q&A response, make sure that you're analyzing it and pulling it back to the original question that was being asked. For historical events and examples, this is pretty self-explanatory. If you have a relevant historical event that pertains to the question being asked, that's a great way to kind of include some more historical context. Again, if you can try to reference like, oh, a historical textbook or a historian at XYZ University, make sure that you have a clear reference for your different pieces of evidence, because like, you know, who's to say that you're not just making it up, right? You want to reference like, oh, historian Gordon Wood in his book XYZ on the American Revolution says this. Again, like specificity is key with evidence. With laws, actions, and policies, this is going to be a little bit different from precedent, which is down at E. This is going to be like, oh, according to US Penal Code number whatever, section whatever, or, local policy in Pleasanton, statute XYZ, a specific piece of legislation or policy is going to be really helpful when you want to talk about the real world application of some theoretical principles that you might be talking about. Current events. This would be, again, a current event, pretty self-explanatory. If you can pull it back to like, oh, like a New York Times article reported that this and this sort of analysis to go with the current event, really try to provide as much context as possible. You know, you don't really want to just say maybe a year ago, like, oh, when Russia invaded Ukraine, you kind of want to go more specifically like, oh, a Gallup poll said this, or Reuters said XYZ about Russia invading Ukraine. I'm kind of sounding like a broken record, but really try to be specific. Early on in you kind of going that throughout We the People, you're not going to be able to get as specific, and that's fine. You're just going to kind of build to it eventually. Moving on to E, precedent. This is going to be your bread and butter, like Supreme Court cases. Make sure that you get the names of the plaintiff and the defendant right, as well as the year. Try to drop the year whenever you can. Like, for example, like Brown v. Board, 1954. That's kind of how specific you can get. You might also want to get into the different justices or judges' dissenting opinions, majority opinions, or concurrences. That's also going to be pretty impressive to the judges. Statistics are going to be just very straightforward statistics. Again, with like, don't make them up. Definitely try to have a reference to a Gallup poll in 2018 found that 30% of Americans don't vote, which is not true. It's like 50%, something like that. So those are going to be very helpful to give you concrete numbers. A lot of the evidence that we're talking about is very abstract. It's a lot of like academic papers or philosophy. So having some numbers every now and then is going to be really impactful and very helpful in strengthening your argument. Lastly, personal stories and anecdotes. This here it says in bold, is a reasonable way to back up an argument. My personal belief is that you should kind of steer clear of the personal stories and anecdotes unless it's very, very relevant and very impactful for the question being asked or for the testimony. Sometimes personal stories can be really, really meaningful, but for the most part, they tend to fall flat compared to a lot of the other heavy hitting evidence that we do have at your disposal. But, if there is an anecdote from your personal experience, whether it's like based on like a racial or gender identity or some other relevant story, that's always really helpful. When I was doing comp civics, one of my unit mates was an immigrant. And so he would speak every so often about the experience of becoming a citizen in the United States and how, the bureaucratic nightmare of the, Citizenship Bureau has taken years and years and things like that. In addition to some more concrete evidence we have, or like some cases or other policies that work in conjunction with the personal stories. So that's about it for the types of evidence. Does anyone have any questions or want me to clarify anything else? Cool. All right. We're great on time, so I'll hand it back to Katie.
I realized I did not do a specific call for questions after the alumni panel. Do any of the current students have questions for any of the folks that were on the panel or any of the judges, either about the content or how that works, anything related to how testimony and hearing structure works.
I have a question for the recent alumni.
Yeah.
So for folks who have gone through the program the last couple of years, can you talk a little bit about what advice you might give to students who are just starting, and include, you know, what are some good resources? What are things that you relied on to make your units better, your testimonies better, your Q&As better, stuff like that?
Okay, yeah. Some advice that I would give you, kind of, especially like these early parts, is just kind of keep it broad. You know, once you get your units, you are going to get the more like specific things down. You have temp units, I think. I'm pretty sure Amador does as well. And so you will learn a lot about the broad topic. But once you get into your units, you will do a lot more specific research. I was in Unit 4. I suggest JSTOR. JSTOR you get through the Pleasanton Library, and you can access a bunch of articles, and there's a lot of good research, and more importantly, like a lot of political scholars that you can cite, and a lot of like book intercept like text and things that you can use. I also suggest that you are able to compromise with your unit mates. It is sometimes very good to have disagreement between your unit mates. It is. I had a lot of disagreements. Like half of my unit was basically split in half between opinions. And so it is important to kind of have that disagreement, especially in hot seat. If you have a series of like, oh, I agree, you want to have a person that says, well, if they do agree, they say, well, I may agree, I could see why. And then you play devil's advocate, show the other side of the coin. And it kind of helps a lot for judges also to grab onto something sometimes and kind of like expand upon your ideas. But yeah.
Hi, I'm Gianni. I was from Unit 3 from 2022. If I had any advice, I would just say absorb as much information as you can right now. I think once you get into your units, you really dive into really unit specific information, like Caden was saying. But I think right now, like the world is your oyster, right? You can learn about anything and you can read about anything. I would say my favorite sources, especially when I was like around this time, I can't remember the name of the podcast, but it is my favorite podcast. They had a season 1 and then their season 2 wasn't great. Does anyone remember podcast I'm talking about?
Are you talking about More Perfect?
Yes, More Perfect. I would say that is it's probably my favorite source, like when you're starting out, because it really breaks down like not just like major concepts, but like political like intricacies. I would say beyond that, I would find a professor that you really align with. I remember for my unit, that was Erwin Chemerinsky. We would always refer to his like law textbooks, his books and everything. And finding someone's like work that you like align with makes it a lot easier when you're like looking for more information long term.
Hi everybody, I'm Gordon. I was a Unit 2 from Foothill last year, and I have 2 pieces of advice. The first one is like, we the people like in competition, no matter how stressed you are, this is still like a conversation you're having with the judges. So like feel free to make it as like exciting or as you want it to be. Put as much personality into it. Because like Unit 2 is like the historical stuff, right? It's like generally like kind of boring, like to a lot of people. So there's no shame in like adding a little bit of flair, a little bit of fire into what you're saying to make it a more opinionated, more memorable for the judges. And also there's no shame. Like this is very sinful, I feel like to say, but there's no shame in like reading an English or like a more modern translation of like an older document, because like reading Hamilton, like Hamilton's a horrible writer, right? Like absolutely no idea what he's saying. So like it's absolutely okay to like go onto like some like reputable website and be like, okay, so this is what he's actually saying, instead of like reading what he's saying.
Quick add-on. Sorry. read court cases. I know everyone recommends OEA, but truly my unit, we would like read like entire court cases, and I feel like it makes such a big impact in not only how you understand court cases, but it gives you a better idea of terminology, like precedent. It gives you like such a big idea of like what's going on. And I know right now you guys probably have assigned readings over the summer, if I'm correct. I know it's overwhelming, but I would really, really try to recommend reading as many of the full court cases as possible. Read the dissenting opinions, read the concurrences, read like everything you can.
Hi, I'm Nicolette from last year's Unit 1, and I think something really important is to work with your unit mates in all the information that you're getting. For example, we had a bit of trouble with, like some of my unit mates had a bit of trouble with the course matter for Plato and Aristotle, and me and my other unit mate, we were very well versed in that, and so we were able to communicate our ideas in a setting. We had a whiteboard. Would be like, oh, these are his base ideas. You don't have to read the whole thing. Like I read the whole thing, but that's because it's like I like to do that. So I think, and other people, they don't like to do that. So it's important, where your unit mates' interests lie. And so you can read that and then share it with them. And then other people, they like other things. And so my other unit mates, they like more modern things. They shared that. So I think it's very important to share things.
Yeah, just jumping in here, I wasn't on the panel, but I am a recent alum. And so going through that process just recently, I think one of the biggest resources is CACE. We'll have the Discord set up, we'll have everything set up once you guys get settled into the school year. But CACE alumni, whether or not they were in your unit or had experience in your unit while they were doing We the People, they have years and years of outside learning, outside experiences that are super, super valuable. And they're literally here, we're literally here to help you, guide you through this process. That's the whole reason we have this organization. And then the other thing I just really, really want to second what Nicolette said, talking with your unit members just generally, it doesn't have to be something has a specific goal. You can literally just, what I think an exercise that my unit did when we were going through the process that was really helpful was we would sit down with one of our testimony questions and then just pick a word or concept within that, and then just try to talk as much as we can about it. And we put it in a voice memo or a voice recording that we could always reference back if we wanted to ever kind of reflect on what our opinions were, different ideas that we were having. And it's super, super valuable to get those ideas out there. And so that everybody else in your unit knows kind of what you're coming from and knows your familiarity with these concepts. So I think for us, one of our questions revolved around this quote that had the word, like the phrase imperium and imperio in it, which it's Latin. It stands for government within a government. But I think the best way that we could have ever kind of gone through with that question was just having a conversation about what do we think that means? How do we think we want to answer it? Stuff like that. So sometimes it can seem very individual that you're doing all this information, all this research by yourself. But ultimately the competition, the program is centered around these small groups, your units, and being able to work together to create this final collaborative project of this mock testimony and mock Q&A. And so I think that's something that should really be kind of at the forefront of what you're doing to prepare.
All right, thank you all so much for that amazing advice. In the interest of time, we need to turn it over to Mari for natural rights. If anyone else has any other advice or resources you want to link to, please do that in the chat. That's also a really helpful resource. And again, feel free to drop questions in the chat as they come up for you. Turning it over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. I do want to kind of touch on I'll just transition what Nicolette said about helping each other out. So I've been teaching for a long time and I've been teaching APUSH for, holy cow, over 20 years now. So I know that culture. So I know all of you are very good students. You are on the upper echelon at both school sites. And I want you to know that I know that you tend to compete against each other in classes. Like if there's a curve to be set, or you've always known so-and-so to be a straight A student and you want to be just the same. Although this is called competition civics, you are not in competition of each other within the class, okay? You need to help each other out. Even if it's from a different unit, like your unit 1 and unit 5 asks, a philosophical question, there's no monopoly on knowledge. There's no, there should not be competition, especially among unit members. So when Nicolette says like spend time with your unit members, like get to know each other and share information, by golly, yeah. This is such a unique experience for you to have in order to stretch yourself, understand how to research, understand how to reason, and help each other. This is a community, really help each other out. All right, so off of my soapbox, I'm going to share my screen again, and here we go. We're heading into natural rights philosophy. And here are 3 kind of go-tos. We got Hobbes, we got Locke, we got Rousseau. And personally, I like them a little bit more than classical republicanism. I just kind of feel like there are some key terms that are easier for me to kind of, comprehend and build off of each other. So Hobbes is the first one to say that people are not naturally social beings. Hobbes is the one who says that we actually originate in a state of nature. So here's your first term in there. State of nature is essentially anarchy. You do not have government ruling over you. On the flip side, though, in a state of nature, there is perfect freedom. There is complete liberty for each individual to kind of see the realization of their natural rights. And of course, their natural rights, the 3 of them, life, liberty, and property, and that you have perfect freedom to exercise that life, liberty, and property. The only issue is that that means someone else can maybe take your life or take your property. So if you have that state of nature that no one is telling you like, you cannot do that because you're in perfect freedom, then that's going to be problematic, because, then our rights are going to be starting to be violated by other people in this, community. So you must have some sort of protection. Remember what I said the last time I was in here, where the key reason for government, the purpose of government is to protect their citizens. That's the same idea here with natural rights philosophers, that there needs to be some kind of protection of one's life, liberty, and property. So a way in order to do that is if individuals willingly give up some of that life, liberty, and property in order to enter into a social contract to be protected by this government. So that's kind of like our starting point. So the purpose of politics, self-preservation, right? That's very natural rights philosophy of I don't want to die. So self-preservation, but also to maintain order, protect rights and liberties, and again, provide a common defense, right? So there's that defense part that you see in both classical republicanism and in natural rights. So good government is seen in natural rights philosophy when the people are sovereign. So remember what I said, sovereignty means where does the power lie? So the power lies in natural rights within the individual. That's why there's that consent. That's why the individuals will give up some of their natural rights in order for that protection, because they have power. So the people have power. Again, getting back to we, the people, we are actually giving that power to the government. Individuals are largely self-sufficient. that is a government of consent. So you're entering into a contract, a social contract. And then when you enter into a contract, there is consent. It can be tacit consent, that you don't actually have to have active consent. You know, like when you go to the DMV to get your driver's license and you're actually signing that, you know, yeah, I'm going to obey all the rules. You're giving active consent. There's also tacit consent, that we're just being in a social, you know, population. We actually are consenting to living up to the laws of the land. The government also obeys the law. You know, it's a catchphrase for that: rule of law. So rule of law, no one is above the law. You're actually going to see that in both of those philosophies as well. And then something kind of unique in natural rights philosophy is that one's public sphere is separate from one's private sphere. Like, government, don't get up in my business, kind of. That's natural rights. Think of how different that is than in classical republicanism, where it's like, oh no, it is our business because we all need to be the same and have, you know, the same kind of identity. So government provides what people want. And here's where you can kind of start breaking down some of the philosophers themselves. Hobbes is really heavy on security. That Hobbes' philosophy is that you were going to have a very strong leader, and that strong leader is going to protect you. And that's a good thing. And then you also have Locke, who doesn't necessarily focus on the leadership as much as the rights, life, liberty, and property, that those need to be protected. And if your government goes through a long train of abuses, then you also have a right to rebel. So bad government examples, if your government is not representative. So remember, if we, the people, hold the power, that means we have to be involved, right? We're the representatives. That is a republic. A representative democracy is a republic. And now can you also see the connection to the need for education? So that's really heavy on classical republicanism, but it's also necessary for under natural rights philosophy, because if we're representing the government, well, you want educated people to be your representatives, right? Bad government would be non-responsive to the needs of the people. That also means people have a responsibility to tell the government when there needs to be some kind of correction. If a bad government also violates your rights, they're not law-abiding. Again, catchphrase in there: if they're not upholding the rule of law. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple of these philosophers. For Hobbes, he says, to secure against the eternal fear of death, of war, of all against all, the people will, as a matter of course, agree to submit to the Leviathan, that supreme power. So Hobbes, his publication is The Leviathan, and this little sketch that you see on here, that's, I don't know, that's kind of like your trigger when you see this document. You're like, that's Hobbes, that's Leviathan, the very strong ruler. That you will still have your individual rights protected, but they're protected by the supreme state, a very strong government. Now, something else that you want to consider too is that Hobbes, actually all of these natural rights philosophers are pretty much writing on behalf of a king. So it's not like any of these philosophers are going to say like, yeah, really shouldn't have any kind of ruler. People should just be able to do whatever they want to do, because like they're being employed by a monarch, essentially. So you pretty much have these philosophers writing on behalf of the monarch of like, yeah, you can be a really strong leader. So Locke, he says that the governed agree to give up absolute liberty. So when I say like give up some of your natural rights, you know, an example is like us going through a TSA check. Now, when we go to the airport, we're getting our rights violated because we're having to, you know, empty our pockets and be screened, you know, in an X-ray screen. But we're willing to do that for the protection of, you know, of us. So primarily the state exists to enforce property and contract rights. Lockean philosophy is really heavy on the property. Locke also believed that the most powerful branch ought to be your legislature, because the legislature has the power to create laws. And those are what rule over people. And that's kind of interesting when you consider that, like, the powerful legislature, if you're thinking of more like a Montesquieu separation of powers with your other two branches of government. So Locke also speaks that there is a right to revolution. If you have a long train of abuses and there is no correction on behalf of the government, you do have a right. In fact, it's not even just a right, it's an obligation. The people have an obligation to overthrow that government and start anew. But remember, when you overthrow the government and start anew, there's a gap in there. And what do we find ourselves in that gap? We find ourselves in a state of nature. So that's where you can also kind of go back to the founders and go, man, things were pretty, intense when they declare independence in July 1776. There needed to be, a backup plan immediately. At least they had individual states that the 13 states were like, yeah, we got this. We have our own government. But at the same time, John Dickinson comes in and says, we got to have, some other kind of government here because we've just thrown off one. And that's where we get our Articles of Confederation. So let's get to Rousseau. Rousseau says, every man having been born free and master of himself, very natural rights. No one else may under any pretext whatever subject him without his consent. So catchphrase there, consent, the consent of the governed, and then going on to assert that the son of a slave is born a slave is to assert that he is not born a man. The Social Contract is a publication of Rousseau, and that should also kind of set off alarms of like, the social contract. Rousseau's really responsible for that. What does that mean when the people consent to the governed and they come under that authority of the governed? So what principles of natural rights will we expect to see in our documents? Again, we're looking at the Declaration, early state constitutions, the Constitution, also add in there, slide in AOC, Articles of Confederation. So in the early state governments, you'll see a lot of natural rights philosophy in how they set up their social contract that is limiting the government. So think of, I always have an issue with students trying to make clear to them that the phrase negative rights is not a bad thing. Negative rights limit your government. So an example of negative rights is just look at our Bill of Rights, and you'll see that Congress shall not make a law that. That's a negative right. Congress shall not make a law. That's limiting your government. That's very natural rights. Instead of the government shall give. When the government gives you stuff, I don't know how much are they going to be giving, and that just grows that government. So you want that limited government. Bill of Rights in the state constitutions, all of them come first, which is usually not what we see because we kind of imagine our Constitution and Bill of Rights come at the end. They were actually purposely put in the state constitutions first. And then they go into, their articles of spelling out their form of government. But also note, why would they come at the end for the Constitution? Is the original thought was, well, the federal government isn't going to need to have those protections for individuals because all the states are protecting those individual rights. But anti-federalist, they had other ideas. And then, of course, rule of law would be, again, both classical republicanism and natural rights have the rule of law. So examples of natural rights influences in the Constitution, you can look at how our Bill of Rights of the Constitution was influenced by other state Bill of Rights, particularly Virginia's. So here is Virginia's Bill of Rights from June 1776. And in section 1, it says that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So I'm hoping that you're just little light bulbs are going off when you read this excerpt and go, is that pretty much where Thomas Jefferson gets the lingo from the Declaration of Independence? And I'll say, boy, howdy, you see it right there. And you even have that hint of pursuing happiness. All right, under the Constitution, examples of natural rights can be seen in the preamble. The act that we write down the Constitution, there's an idea of written and unwritten constitutions. England is an example of an unwritten constitution because it's a collection of documents, whereas in the United States, we write that puppy down. And other people in other nations kind of think we're a little funny because we cite the Constitution, but boy, howdy, we cite the Constitution, carry our pocket constitutions where we go. You can see natural rights reflected in the separation of powers and how that also creates checks and balances. And then that legislative supremacy, remember I said that Locke was really heavy on legislative supremacy. And then also in those checks and balances, how we have elections, how we have checks with impeachment and the removal of elected officials. So this is a really great quote from James Monroe, where you can kind of see how the founders have both of these ideas in their mind when they are creating our new government of classical republicanism and natural rights. He says, Americans have always managed to weigh the celebration of the individual with responsibility for the community, market striving with civic caring, the private sphere and the public good. What a great quote to just see how these two go together. So we're going to take just a moment to kind of reflect, and I want you to kind of reflect this on your own, just like a mental exercise, thinking about Unit 1 in a personal term. Why do you behave as you do? How much is your behavior influenced by fear of punishment, as opposed to a sense of moral or public duty? And how do your personal views relate to Unit 1 questions about classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy? So here's a little mental kind of, exercise for you. Imagine that there's an armored truck that's filled with cash and it sits at the curb, the doors are wide open, and you miraculously are invisible. No one is going to know if you take the money or not. Do you take the money? So I'll end with a story that's kind of similar to this. And it was many years ago. My kids were like one was still in a car seat and the other two were kind of like boosters maybe. We were going to head off during spring break for our first like family cruise. And on the cruises, they have like a dress up night. So I had to go and get the kids, like shirt and tie so they look nice. So I drive over to the Kohl's in Livermore. And as I'm driving into the parking lot, it's pretty windy because it's right there on 580. I see a flitting of like papers. They kind of look like leaves, but they're like flitting through where I'm driving. And I look at them and, oh my God, they're dollar bills. And I'm like, money, 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 money. And I pull my car over. I just put it in park. I mean, total irresponsible mom moment. Like I don't turn off the car or anything. I leave my kid there in the car seat. I jump out and I'm grabbing at all of these bills. And the other two older ones, they jump out and they're grabbing all the bills. And I have this moment of truth in my head that as I was following the source, a little thing in my head clicked and said, if you follow the source, you will find the source and you'll have to return it. If you stop now, you can just take the money and it's just like, oh, mysteriously, like there's money floating through the parking lot. I look at the source. I find a men's wallet that's been way overstacked with cash. And it literally looked like the wind was just making it rain. It just was picking up each of those bills. So I find the wallet, I grab the wallet. My kids are grabbing all of these bills. Thank God there's not other people driving through, hitting my kids in the parking lot. We jump in the car, we count all the money. And it's this random number of like $287 or something. And there's a driver's license in there. And I remember sitting there in my car going, my kids are watching me. This is my moment. Do I do the right thing? Or, we're kind of hard up on cash. Maybe I should just like grab the cash. Oh no. I look the guy up. I call him. I say, hey, did you lose a wallet? He's like, oh my God, I lost a wallet. It's like $287. I'm like, that's exactly what we found. I'll be at Kohl's, you can come on by and pick it up. And I am not judging this man. Walked in a wife beater t-shirt, looking kind of scruffy. And I'm thinking, don't think it's drug money. Maybe he was just really lucky at, poker with his friends, but not judging. He gave me $20, like, thanks so much for finding my wallet, and left. And I was like, civic virtue? What would you have done? All right. Thank you for dealing with my fun little story there. I hope it makes you reflect on that natural rights, classical Republican ideals in yourself, because we are those civic bodies. Have a great year, all.
Hey everyone, awesome. Thank you so much for that overview. That was really helpful. I am just setting up breakout rooms right now. I know we had a break scheduled on there, but just in the interest of time, I think I'm going to move us into breakout rooms and give y'all a chance to talk, because I know there's been a lot of presentations you've been listening to, but we're really excited to get a chance to chat with you in the breakout rooms. So I have created assignments for breakout rooms where there are some CACE volunteers. And then there are also groups of students. So you should be all good to go into that once I open the rooms. Just join that breakout room. What we're going to be chatting about in the breakout room, and this is really, I think, an interesting question, and we'll look forward to seeing what comes out of the different rooms. But the prompt for your discussion in the breakout rooms is, what is the most important duty of citizenship? What is the least important duty, and why? So while give yourself a chance to think about that, but that's what you'll be talking about in groups. And we'll come back here at about 12:40 to kind of debrief, bring back our answers from our different breakout groups, and talk through all of that. So I'm going to open that right now. If anyone does not get a breakout room notification, let me know and I will help you out. But head on over. Thank you so much. Here today. Alrighty, awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat about that. I'm curious if any students from the different breakout rooms would like to share first, what kind of ideas of duties of citizenship you came up with. Feel free to pop onto video and say it with your mouth, or you can put it in chat if you would like. Anyone?
One of the major
Students,
things.
feel free to pop your camera on and you can join in. Sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
perfect.
Yeah. One of the main things we talked about, there were a lot of things. We kind of made a list of all of the possible civic duties. One of the things was just obeying the rule of law and making sure it applies. So following good laws, and following good laws if they exist, and being just I don't know, obeying the government, and not obeying the government if you aren't supposed to. If the government does something that shouldn't, you need to be able to contradict it, make sure it's held accountable. So making sure the rule of law applies to you and to the government as well.
Cool, thank you for sharing. Does anyone else want to pop in? You can also
we're voting right
now. We will in a little bit. I'm putting some notes. I got sent some ideas from the breakout rooms, but I'd love to hear it directly from students too. And if just popping in verbally with your voice is feeling a little overwhelming, feel free to just raise your hand and I can call on you if that feels a little less like you may accidentally come in at the same time as someone else.
You meant to say voting is an important right.
Oh, thank you, Zelda. I'm so sorry. Yes, voting is important. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, so some of the ones that were listed that I got sent over to me were jury duty, volunteering, education, voting, protest or petition, paying taxes, military service, and then kind of what Peter just shared in terms of rule of law, either following laws or helping to make better laws as an idea there too. Any other ones that came up that are not encompassed by that list? Okay. Well, I'm curious in terms of your discussions today, did anything stick out as particularly important out of the different duties you talked about? Anything that your group is like, yes, this is really important, or anything that felt like it wasn't really as important? It's one of those kinds of value questions where some things might be really important to one person or one group or one community and less important to another person or group or community. So curious about what your breakout rooms thought. Or if any volunteers remembered some really good insights that students had in their group too. If people are not wanting to talk to the whole group, that's okay too. But
Yeah, so in our room, voting obviously came up first, as it always does. But there was a lot of discussion about education and staying informed, and making sure that you're an educated citizen and not just voting randomly. And so we talked about K through 12 education and moral education, and just staying informed and talking on, engaging in civil discourse, maybe on a New York Times comment section, or places where people are discussing current events and things that are important to society.
Awesome, thank you. It sounds like a really good conversation. Anyone else keen to share?
I thought that in our breakout room, Clint brought up a good point about jury duty. He said how a lot of jurors are usually might end up on the more wealthier side because they have more time to, take off and do jury duty. So it sounds like a more of a certain demographic. And that's why it's more important as like someone who's like not, as like wealthy, or as, just have like an other side of the opinion and have a different lifestyle than some of these other jurors is important. And it's important to kind of bring that to jury duty and have like a fair trial.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really apt point, right? Like there's certain things that might be difficult for people to pull off in terms of time or energy or attention, but especially in terms of jury duty, right? Like to have truly a jury of one's peers, it needs to be representative of more than just one small group of the population. Anyone else?
I think in our breakout room, we briefly touched on military service, but I think we kind of regarded it as not being one of the more important civic duties. And I think one point that was brought up was, the United States doesn't have mandatory military service. So it's something that, you kind of voluntarily do, whereas other countries that have mandatory military service, they might consider it to be a more important civic duty. So we kind of place that towards the bottom of our list because of that.
We had a pretty interesting conversation about the accessibility of information and voting and citizenship, because once you get your ballot, there's a whole bunch of people to look at and read about, but realistically, a lot of people just don't have the time or the resources to spend on educating themselves on all the dozens of people to vote for just by nature of the economic system. And so there's this big disparity for people who have, the time and access to resources and can be educated voters, and people who are just in a position who frankly just can't do that, not by any fault of their own, but because of a whole bunch of other circumstances that are out of their control.
Yeah, our breakout room is really similar. I think our discussion mostly focused on voting as well. But I think one really valuable part of that, I think that one of our students mentioned, was kind of tolerance and open-mindedness within civil disobedience, and then also just making sure that everybody has equal access to civil discourse and that opinions are heard. So kind of within that same vein, but going off into a little bit more of a nuanced direction.
Awesome, thank you. I will just give it one more second in case there's anyone else that wants to pop in to share something, and then I have a poll that's ready to go that I will run based off of some of the ideas that people shared. Okay. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, we're gonna go. I'm opening up this poll. Feel free to go ahead and vote.
Whoever voted for jury duty, I appreciate you.
Okay, last 3 people, please go ahead and vote. 2 people. Okay, I'm gonna count down from 5 and then we're gonna close the polls. And if you didn't make it, you didn't make it, okay? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All righty. Thank you for voting, if you did take the time to vote. Okay, so it looks like in terms of our most important duty, most people, the winner here was voting, which got 38% of the vote. But
Pop that up on the screen. I don't think we're seeing it.
Oh, share results. That's the button I was supposed to press. There we go. Can everyone see it now? Thank you. It's been a hot minute since I ran a poll, so I forgot how it worked. Okay, so yeah, so our leader here is voting with 38% of the vote, which, you know, that is a pretty important one. It is pretty closely followed, though, by education and then by protests and petitions. I think that's a really interesting kind of spread of thoughts there. There's a couple other ones that got some votes. And then scrolling down to our least important duty of citizenship. In this situation, this group primarily voted for military service, and maybe were swayed by some of the arguments made there. And then followed that by jury duty and volunteering, but those got a lot less votes. So that was a pretty overwhelming vote there.
I appreciate how much everyone in this group wants to pay their taxes. Not always one of the popular choices in the voting from year to year.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I think an interesting thing about this, like we said before, right, there's a lot of different things that go into this, and maybe some of those are connected for you. So breaking it out into like a most important, least important is a dichotomy that might not embrace all the different kind of perspectives and opinions along the way. But in your group, you got to have a little bit of a more nuanced discussion of that. I think that's one of the fun parts about We the People is sometimes we get asked these big questions. And yeah, there's, you know, sometimes they're phrased in a way that you need to answer it. And, you know, like you need to say like, I am staking my claim on this particular thing. But the most important thing is the why. And I'm really hopeful that you guys got a chance to talk about that why today. You know, this program really emphasizes the why and the reasoning and the taking time to discuss those things. So I think that was a really good exercise as you move forward towards that. I think that is everything we have scheduled today for summer session number 2. So I think we'll be wrapping up a little early. Like I said before, we recorded summer session number 1. We just recorded summer session number 2. So all of these are available if you have classmates that weren't able to make it, need access to this information. And summer session 3 is coming up. So make sure you join us for that too. Does anyone else have any last things to add from the CACE side of things? No. Awesome. All right. Well, we'll let you go early.
Katie, thanks for running this. Yeah.
Great job, Katie.
Awesome. Yeah. So thank you all so much for your help and for your participation. We'll let you all go. Have a great rest of your Saturday. I'll stick around just in case anyone has any questions that came up around stuff today that they want to stick around at the end for.